Hello and welcome to our Q&A session following the Australian Road Research Board's free webinars on the best practice guides for bridge management. My name is Neva Tonkam and I'll be moderating the session today, and we'll go for about 40 minutes. We are all following government guidelines and working from home, so fingers crossed that all our technology works. Today's presenters are Tim Helt, Neil Lake, Robert Mickeljohn and Darby Johansson. Tim leads the ARB Structures team, delivering outcomes in the fields of structures and asset management. The focus is on providing value through better tailored team decisions made faster. Neil is part of the ARB Structures leadership team. He focuses on providing strong emphasis on quality outcomes that address the needs of his clients. Neil led the technical development of the Bridge Management Best Practice Guide. Robert is part of the ARB Structures team and is focused on delivering structural inspection and asset management programs for local government and private clients. Robert was the project manager for the guide development and involved in the initial consultation with local government. Darby is part of the ARB Structures team and has worked in the areas of bridge loading analysis, risk management and asset management development. Darby was heavily involved in guide development, being the lead writer for several key guide sections and contributing to most others. We had so many questions come through during the webinar that we couldn't get through them all, and so our presenters will talk us through them today. So let's get started with the first question, and I'll hand over to Tim.
Thanks very much, Neva. Well, I suppose the project team were engaged in a fairly extensive stakeholder engagement process, primarily with local government staff, and that was to establish what's the need, what would be helpful, what do people actually want, cognizant that there was an already existing ARB manual on this topic. But we had a look at the feedback from the stakeholders and realised that the manual didn't really address the need that we identified, so we had to decide what to do. And in deciding what to do, we also had to decide what not to do. So some of the things we decided not to do was to write an asset management manual. There's one of the questions we got, I suppose, was, in the webinar, we didn't make any mention of the International Infrastructure Management Manual, the sort of companion AIFMM, professional qualifications and NAMs and so on. That was really, we were pretty stretched for time in the webinar. We decided that there was a lot of really good material, a lot of it coming out of the of IPWIA, including IIMM and AIFMM, and that's extensively referred to in the guide itself. And we decided that, why duplicate that? There's some really good material out there, and if you want to know more about asset management per se, lots of good stuff there. We didn't want to prepare an asset management system framework, something like NAMS or some of the other ones around, because they're already there. There's no point duplicating those. There's some really good stuff around. We didn't want to prepare an asset management training package. Again, there's lots of good material around postgrad courses and so on. And we didn't want to prepare a bridge technical manual. From the 20 years ago when the original manual came out, Austroads have done a lot of good work. Technical elements, as in engineering technical and construction technical elements of bridges, are pretty well covered in the Austroads details. If we were going to update the original manual, firstly, there was going to be a lot of work which would be duplicating stuff already on the market. And secondly, even if we did that, based on the feedback, we wouldn't actually be addressing the problems that had been identified. So even though all the above are extensively available in local government, what we've noticed and what the stakeholder feedback really illustrated is that there hasn't actually been a significant change in bridge management practice over the last 20 or 30 years. In our experience operating commercially, and particularly with local government, when the issues are discovered on a bridge or a culvert, we've yet to see the first port of call being to go and have a look at the asset management plan or the SAMP or the long-term financial plan as the first port of call, and seldom as any port of call. No one tends to go to that. What people tend to do is look at the level 2 inspection and ask the technical issues about what should be done next, what's the diagnosis and so on. All good questions, but as an industry, we're not yet using the asset management frameworks that are already in place. And the underlying issue seems to be that current bridge management practice does not yet interface effectively with available asset management practice. And so clearly that needs to change. And over time, that certainly will change. Business systems will evolve and develop and so on. And so really, the gap that we tried to address in developing the guide is really around, regardless of the status of the agency's business systems, what are the key on-the-ground decision, knowledge and practices that represent bridge-specific good practice? How can we change those day-to-day, year-to-year, and sometimes even strategic decisions that will facilitate better outcomes now while we're waiting for the business systems to be updated to embed those processes? And the feeling was that by facilitating better decisions now, that will help reduce the barriers to business system change, and it will also therefore lead to better bridge management outcomes in the medium term. There were some other questions around our use of the Institute of Asset Management framework as opposed to, say, the IIM and so on. There are many frameworks out there. The reason for using the Institute of Asset Management framework was really a pragmatic one. We had about 6 weeks to put together the first draft of the manual, and we had some existing material using the Institute of Asset Management framework and so on. So we basically went with that because we already had some presentation and material available to us. And in any event, if you prefer to use, you could go through our slide pack and change out the Institute of Asset Management framework and put the IIM or whatever you want in there. Doesn't change the argument. Goes back to what I just finished saying, that fundamentally, with all these new tools and that are available, we still haven't seen any actual change in bridge management practice, and that's what we're trying to get. We're trying to get a change on the ground. We're trying to get better decisions. And so, as I said, that's really what we were trying to address. There's a lot of good case studies in the IIM and the OFMM that are certainly applicable. And some of the feedback we got was that, hey, it'd be really good to have some case studies. Totally agree. Problem was we had about 6 weeks to completely rewrite the guide. And so we were, I guess, constrained to try and set out the fundamental principles as a first step in providing a broader set of tools. So that provides a little bit of framing on, I suppose, how we approach the guide. And if you thought the guide was prepared in a fairly rapid time frame, the webinar even more so, in the sense that we only had really a bit over half an hour to try and condense what we were doing. So would love to have done more. There's certainly more opportunities that we'd like to pursue, but I guess the resource and time constraints really was configuring us there. One of the questions we had was, I suppose, at having listened to the webinar content, so no fundamental changes to the technical issues around bridge management, and the answer is really no. The technical issues haven't changed. The changes, as we've said, have really been in the management processes and in that journey from maintenance management to asset management. When it comes to bridge data collection, how how is need for sufficient information balanced against the cost and practicality of collecting data on a large number of bridges and so on, as you can see outlined in that question there. I guess our view is that, you know, while we've just said that there needs to be a significant shift in bridge management practice, one of the areas I think that we probably do reasonably well, and certainly by comparison with other industry sectors, is across the country we've got a fairly consistent level 1, level 2, level 3 inspection process, which really sets out reasonably good data collection approaches. And, you know, we present bridge inspection training across the country, and every jurisdiction is slightly different, but essentially they're all variations on a theme. So we feel that that's reasonably well covered by existing practice. I guess some of the thoughts around that are that if you want to know what to do, if you've got, you know, very little resource, it's get your level 1s done. And there's fairly standard templates for how to do that, and that's probably best done by internal agency staff or local suppliers, and then escalate if you can. So if you, in terms of a prioritisation of data, get your level 1s done first. Level 2s are important, but they are more beneficial if the people doing the inspections actually have a good skill level. So our advice around level 2s would be to avoid the tick and flick level 2s. And I guess when you put the level 1 and level 2 information together, the thought from us would be make sure we use that data. The issue isn't so much around the data collection, it's whether or not we're actually even using that data as effectively as we could. And there's room for growth there. But if I was looking for improvement opportunities around bridge management and data collection, my sense would be to stay with the current level 1 and level 2 for the moment, and actually improve the back-end systems that receive that data and make sure we're getting the best out of those, because they're fairly well established and the cost for those has come down over time. Level 3 inspections is an area for efficiency improvement that we see. And one of the common themes we see is where a level 3 inspection either gets over-specified or under-specified. It can be over-specified because sometimes we see scopes where there's a requirement to investigate every possible thing there is from a technical point of view on an asset, when in reality, to answer the question, you probably just need to know, some of the early questions like, is it recoverable? If the answer is no, then don't worry too much about too much more technical investigation, start planning the replacement. And sometimes they get under-specified. So in other words, someone will say, for example, go and look at the bearings on the bridge in a level 3 because they don't real flash, when bearings might be only part of the issue. So our advice around level 3 is to actually look at the triggers for the level 3 and map out the decisions that are going to flow from the information that you get in from level 3s, and then sensibly package that to go far enough to answer your questions, but not so far as to comprehensively specify every technical issue on the asset. So those are some of the approaches why we ended up, I guess, with the guide and the webinar that we did. Not perfect, more money and resources and time. We'd probably do things a bit differently. And is more needed? Yes. Are we trying to comprehensively address all of the things? Not at all. We're trying to fit into a pretty well-developed network of technical and asset management systems and capability, and address a specific need that we saw coming out of the of the stakeholder engagement. So that probably covers off our overall approach. And if we move to the next question.
Yep, so the next question comes from Justin, and they've asked, so no fundamental changes to the technical approaches to bridge management, more so the asset management.
And that's correct. There's lots more up-to-date references than the ARB 2000 bridge manual. The engineering processes are reasonably well developed. The asset management practices have changed a lot since the 2000 manual, and the guide is an attempt to try and bring the essence of those developments into day-to-day practice, and hopefully lead and facilitate the business system changes that are required. I think that probably answers that one.
Great. So the next question came from Abdul, and they've asked, at what stage should asset management teams be involved in terms of planning / design of new assets?
Thanks, Neva. It's Neil here. I'll take this question. Well, I guess historically, many view asset management as something that happens after the asset has been created. But the unfortunate reality is that after the asset's created, many of the life cycle costs were effectively locked in during the design and planning phases and construction. And this was pretty well demonstrated in Tim's presentation. And I think also there are many variables associated with the performance and risk that are also locked in. Let's take an example like something like a steel structure. The decision to use steel, locks in many costs associated with paint protection and upkeep. And these things can enormously affect the life cycle cost, and they also affect the frequency of maintenance schedules. And obviously for steel, this is often more frequent. So, those sort of things are locked in very early. During the design phase is really a key time where the performance capability becomes really locked in. I think also, designing to ensure access for inspections is really critical, and that has to happen, before. So it has to happen in those planning and design phases. Like if I think about all the major headaches that major road authorities have, around their bridges, they generally revolve around problems where they have a lot of trouble gaining access to verify structural performance, or not being able to replace items when they fail, when, these are items that commonly fail within the lifetime of the structure, like a bearing. If there's no plan to actually be able to jack the bridge and get a bearing out, well then, you've got a real problem on your hands. If I think about some other examples, there'd be things like halving joints in concrete structures, mast connections on cable stays, bearing shelf access for inspections. These are all things that are real headaches for road authorities, and the only way to address this is at the start of the process. So I guess, like in summary, really, asset management should be seen as an all-encompassing discipline, and it really shouldn't be just limited to a certain team. And you really need to have an organisational approach that takes you all the way through the various phases of the life cycle. And certainly, you really have to have asset management teams or people really thinking about the asset management, the later life asset management. They need to be present during those planning and design phases of new assets. I think it's also really important that to really effectively undertake asset management, you need to really connect to the organisational goals and strategies. And this is right through from operational planning through to execution. And this can only be done if asset management is considered during all phases of the life cycle, I guess. I think that asset management should really be viewed as a complete discipline and really needs to be considered all the way through, I think is probably the key takeaway from that. I think we could move to the next question. Thanks.
Okay, so the second part of this question is, how much design experience is recommended before entering into asset management?
Thanks, Neva. I think that this is a really interesting question because, design is a really useful skill to have. However, the mindset of an asset manager and a design engineer is quite different. You know, an effective asset manager really needs to think in terms of performance, cost, and managing risk. Whereas I think that, you know, a typical structural engineers training is focused a little bit more on code compliance. And so while design is really useful skill to have, it can be a limitation if someone is not really able to broaden their awareness and understanding beyond this concept of code compliance. You know, I would say that typically someone within an asset management team needs to have exposure to design. These are really important skills. However, you know, this sort of skill set could be outsourced, I guess, within a team. I think really you could argue that each of the subsets of an asset lifecycle, planning, you know, design, construction, you know, the maintenance, the inspections, all of those are useful elements for an asset manager to have experience in, and certainly they need those capabilities within a team. Design is not inherently more important than those other disciplines, and I think that generally broader experience is probably more useful than experience in any one specific discipline if this was advice to someone wanting to get into the asset management field. Having said all that, you know, if you're looking for a good grounding in structural engineering, I think typically 2 to 3 years would, you know, typically give you a pretty strong grounding in structural engineering and really allow you to move on with that with, you know, good grounding going into the asset management field.
Okay, great. So the next question comes from Seydu, and they've asked, there are 39 subjects under the 6 facets of asset management conceptual model in the GFMAM, IAM, and ISO 55000 documents. How do these subject items relate to bridge management data and implementation for proactive decision making? Do we need to manipulate bridge inspection data compatible to those 39 subjects or closely related ones only?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Neva. It's Darby here, and I'll take this one. So in the first instance, you'd consider closely related subjects, and the decisions you're trying to make and the questions that you're trying to answer will, to a degree, define where you use that data. I put together an example on the next slide for bridge inspection data. If you could just move that, Neva. Yeah, so taking your example of bridge inspection data, you'd collect that under number 17 in Group 3, Lifecycle Delivery, asset operations. So that's what you'd conduct your bridge inspections under. Then that would come down and be stored under an asset information system in accordance with number 24 of Group 4. And you'd also typically have some sort of data and information management policy in place which controls like how that data is gated and who's able to access it and so on. Now, once you've got that data stored and you're managing it, it would then come out and be used in a range of subjects, such as, say, number 6 in Group 2, which is your capital investment decision making. The relative condition of bridges is going to be a large contributor to your decisions on capital investment, in addition to other data such as your financial information and, say, user performance requirements. Now, another subject group where you might use your bridge inspection data is risk and review. For example, bridge inspection is a large contributor to identifying your hazards and can also act as a review measure on the effectiveness of any existing mitigations in place for bridges, such as, say, mass limits or partial closures. Now, so far I've looked at, I've talked about groups where you might directly use your bridge inspection data, but there may also be groups where you use it at a higher level after, say, some amalgamation or further review. So that could be, for example, Group 1, your asset management policy. Your bridge inspection is going to a degree, inform what assets you have, what are the typical issues you have, and that's going to contribute to the development of your asset management policy, along with, say, a range of other factors such as your such as your personnel base, the resources you have available to you, and the users of your network. And yeah, so in conclusion, that you should manipulate bridge inspection data and other data based on closely related subjects in the first instance, but as you sort of develop your asset management approach and as that matures, and also as the decisions you're trying to make expand in scope, your bridge inspection data is likely to be a contributor to a greater range of subjects than just the initial set of directly related subjects which are highlighted here. I think that answers that question.
Great, thank you. So moving on to the next question, which comes from Steve, and they've asked, from an asset management point of view, and particularly life cycle management, i.e. acquisition, maintenance, operations, renewal and disposal, is distinction made between what comprises maintenance and renewal in the manual. This may be particularly relevant to developing capital programs and asset management plans.
Yeah, thanks, Neva. Well, the short answer to that is no. We've generally considered maintenance and renewal together in the manual, with some of the more common renewal tasks coming in under non-routine and specialist maintenance, sort of different to routine maintenance. And we're considering bridges for renewal for bridges as typically bearing and joint replacement, which are, say, tasks for which the need is predictable and it's only a question of when you actually do it. And other renewal tasks could be concrete repair and strengthening, which are infrequent and expensive tasks compared with your routine maintenance. Generally, we see that categorisation of a task into either maintenance or renewal will be dependent on the specific business rules of an organisation, including their accounting practices. And often it will be the actual cost of the works that will dictate the categorisation. Now, coming back to the example that I mentioned of concrete repair, say if you had $5,000 worth of crack injection works, that might be classified as maintenance, but if you had $100,000 worth of crack injection works, you might classify that as renewal. And considering this fact that similar works could be classified as maintenance or renewal just depending on how much they cost, and that might vary between different organisations, we took the approach of not specifically identifying certain tasks as renewal or maintenance in order to provide guidance that will not be limited by organisational business rules. So really key then is to take a holistic approach when developing your capital programs and asset management plans, which considers the target cost, risk and performance set points of your network and the assets, and sort of articulate how a certain maintenance or renewal task will contribute to maintaining assets at these set points. And really, the point there is to not be limited by how a task is categorised when deciding how to allocate your resources to sort of best manage your network. I think that answers that question.
Great, thank you. So the next two questions come from Daniel and Stephen. The first one is regarding level 3 inspections. If the bridge consultant suggests a level 3 inspection, how can we determine if it is needed or not?
Thanks, Neva. It's Neil here. I'll take this question. I mean, the really short answer to this is that, will the level 3 investigation answer the question that you have? And I think this really has to drive the whole processes around determining what and what isn't needed. Now, let's go through maybe a bit longer answer there. The answer to that question really, and how you answer it really depends a lot on the level of experience that you have. So let's take an example. Let's say that, in a particular situation, an asset manager is fairly inexperienced in structural evaluations and is really relying on the consultant for their engineering expertise, which is probably the scenario that I think would be most likely from a question like that. And I think, like, first of all, you've got to ask, well, what is the actual problem that you're trying to solve? And you need to understand what the level 3 investigation will actually answer in that. So you can ask the consultants questions to really justify the level 3 investigation. Like, what are the likely outcomes from this investigation? Are they in the ballpark of something useful? Importantly, how will that level 3 investigation help, and will the outcomes lead you to a point critically where a decision can be made? Because at the end of the day, you're undertaking all this level 3 work and you get to the end and you go, oh, we still can't make a decision. Well, then all of that work is not very useful. So I think it's always really critical to keep this point at the forefront of your mind. Ultimately, decision mapping is what you need to be thinking about, and really should be formed right from the start and form the basis of your investigation. So let's take another example. For instance, if you've got a bridge that has a capacity problem and access has to be restricted to heavy vehicles, if you go and do this level 3 work, how much more additional capacity is likely to come from the investigation? These are questions that you can ask your consultant. How much closer you're going to be? If you're 50%, if your current estimate is you're out by 50%, then it's pretty unlikely that any level of investigation is going to magically get you there. And so you really should take a different course of action. So, that question of how close you are becomes really important. And are favourable outcomes even possible? Are they likely? Are they unlikely? How much will it cost? Importantly, will the consultant be able to recommend the outcome? This is very important because, really at the end of the day, it's all a question of liability. And, who's going to accept the liability from these decisions? And I'll talk a bit more about that in the next question. It's important when scoping level 3 investigations to determine what the alternatives are, right? So, there's all those likely outcomes and all that sort of thing that you need to be thinking about. But right at the start, you go, well, what are the alternatives that we could think about for this particular situation? It's something that's absolutely critical to think about before rushing headlong into very expensive and costly investigations. And as Tim was alluding to earlier in this question and answer session, we've seen many requests come out to do investigations where we look at it and we go, geez, why would you want to go and work out what the service, what the dynamic amplification estimate is on all of these bridges by testing, when you're only going to test at a service level? You're not going to get the information that you need to make that decision at ultimate. So, at the end of the day, you spend an enormous amount of money and it gets you no closer to an effective outcome. I think it's also important to think about, how do the various options and stuff relate to the strategic direction of the organisation? And there's many factors that you consider in this regard. So, I guess to summarise, it's really about what is the problem or question that you're trying to solve. You need to really work closely with your consultant, use a bit of nous to really drag out of them how it's going to help and how you're going to get to a point where you can make a decision. So I think we'll move on to the next question, thanks.
Okay, so the next question is, level 3 assessment typically results in overly conservative load ratings based on standards, inherent safety margins, methods, simplistic methods due to limited price engagements, and risk appetite of external parties, consultants, PI. How do you balance this rating versus actual perceived operating capacity, performance over time under no loads, and impact on road users and community?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I'll take this one again, Neva. Yes, codes are inherently conservative due to their non-specific nature. A codified design needs to cover the gambit of situations that could possibly be encountered. And when you're in that design phase, the costs associated with increasing the performance of a structure is relatively marginal. You can increase the capacity by quite a large margin, and it might only cost 5% more. So at that stage, those sorts of decisions are they're not as critical in the total cost. Now, obviously, you can do site-specific evaluation and make use of site-specific parameters. And this can be done using codes like AS 500 Part 7 and also using AS 13822. All of these can be used as potential frameworks to really improve the potential outcomes. But these things are expensive, and you need to do appropriate planning and preliminary investigations to ensure that appropriate value can really be extracted from the work, I guess. What the consultant will sign off is really an important consideration. I think at the end of the day, if you want to outsource your liability, then don't expect solutions that lie outside the generic code approaches. Basically, their liability just can't support that. That's not what they're in business for. I think really to do asset management well, the managing organisation really needs to take ownership of their risks and develop appropriate performance risk and cost trade-offs and develop appropriate risk management strategies that work for the chosen course of action. And I think really just overall too, always be conscious of the do nothing and complete replacement benchmarks and what cost, risk, performance parameters these present. I think just summing up this question though, I think that it's important to have a bit of a broader look. I mean, level 3 is currently a very technically focused activity out in the industry. And I'd ask the question, well, how much more do you really need to know technically to make decisions? And, there are many situations where that is actually the case, but maybe it's time to start thinking more about solutions to better scope level 3 technical investigation that really focus on the outcomes rather than just gaining a little bit more technical knowledge.
Okay, great. And we're actually up to our final question. This comes from Janine, and they've asked, do you know any common register/source that collects costs of maintenance actions and testing cost, UB/LB cost across agencies?
Thanks, Neva. It's Robert. I'll take that one. Look, the short answer to that question is no one we know currently does this, but we would probably suggest that they should and make that register asset and activity specific. There may be some resources out there where asset managers may be able to get costs for some common items, such as Rawlinson's construction handbook, or direct with companies that actually sell or rent testing equipment. But the big thing that I would probably want to think about when considering costs of maintenance actions and testing is that they tend to be very context specific. This could be in relation to what access equipment is required. Are you in an urban versus regional area, and therefore you may have access to more or less suppliers? And also just the extent of the area component really to be tested. An example of that could be the testing cost for one bridge is going to be a lot cheaper if the testers are able to access it by foot underneath, as opposed to when they may have to shut a road, get traffic control in, get underbridge access inspection unit or other such scaffolding, other access equipment, or if it's over a railway line, and then therefore you need to account for the cost of interfacing with the rail authority. And this has really been our experience when looking at maintenance and testing costs. A fairly high proportion of it is in that upfront mobilisation. I think that's all I have to say on the question, and concludes our presentation here today.
Okay, thank you for that. ARB delivers numerous workshops and webinars covering topics across the transport sector. If you're interested in a private workshop for your council group or organisation or company, please get in touch. We can be flexible with how workshops are delivered, so we can tailor delivery to meet your organisation's needs, especially in these crazy times. Please refer to the ARB website at www.arb.com.au for information on these. And if you are interested in running a specific workshop on one or more, please contact us directly at guides@arb.com.au.